Gentlemen, thank you for coming along to this policy exchange fringe event looking at trade and the Indo-Pacific tilt. This is an area where Policy Exchange has done several pieces of work looking at accession to the CPTPP and also our major paper on a very British tilt, which looked at this issue before the integrated review, also concluded that tilting to the Indo-Pacific should be a major part of British diplomacy and trade policy for the future. I'm delighted to welcome the Secretary of State for International Trade, Right Honourable Kemi Badenoch. To my left is Alexander Downer, the long-serving former Foreign Minister of Australia and the Chair of Policy Exchange Trustees. To his left is Aileen, Head of International Public Policy at Diageo, who are kindly partnering with us for this panel. And to my right, and right to the Secretary of State, is Shevaun, Haviland, the Director General of the British Chamber of Commerce. And to the far right is Lord Billamoria, former President of the CBI and is also a trustee of Policy Exchange. So what I'm going to ask our speakers to do is to set out their opening remarks over 3 or 4 minutes, and then we will try and have a conversation with questions. I'm sure there'll be many from the floor. I might throw in a few of my own as well. So what I'm going to do is ask Alexander Downer to start for us, if that's okay.
I'll have to do it. Thanks very much. When Policy Exchange started to put together its work on what became known and is now called, in the context of the integrated review, the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, Policy Exchange's premise was that the centre, the locus of the global economy, is moving increasingly to the Indo-Pacific. Now, in spite of the fall-off in China's growth rates, driven partly by their COVID lockdown policies and partly by their over-reliance on property and the burst of their property bubble. Nevertheless, I think that basic proposition that the locus of the global economy is moving to the Indo-Pacific and away from the transatlantic region remains true. And therefore, for post-Brexit UK, it is very important to be successfully engaged in commercial terms, both in terms of trade and, importantly, in terms of investment in that part of the world. The UK has made a good start, particularly Liz Truss, as the Secretary of State for International Trade, made a good start in picking, if you like, the low-hanging fruit of free trade agreements with my own country, Australia, and with New Zealand. But these are free trading countries, so doing free trade agreements with them is never going to be very difficult. The challenge is to be able to expand that in a really substantive way. And it seems to me that the UK has a very good strategy of becoming part of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. The free trade, if you could call it that, it's pretty free trade area of 11 countries in the Indo-Pacific. It was to include the United States until President Trump pulled the United States out of it. And I mean, I think the Secretary of State will know better than I do how well the UK's negotiations with the CPTPP are going. Obviously, the whole agreement is not going to be changed for the UK.
We don't discuss ongoing negotiations. That's the answer that I give whenever I'm asked that.
But I can. And I know from the Australian perspective, Australia has been very welcoming of the UK in these negotiations. And I have to say, to get into that agreement, which includes not just Australia and New Zealand, the so-called low-hanging fruit, but countries like Japan, the third biggest economy in the world, that would be a huge step forward in terms of building the UK's trade links with the Indo-Pacific region. So I've only got a few minutes. So the last thing I want to say is that Australia and New Zealand may be low-hanging fruit. The high-hanging, extremely juicy fruit is a trade agreement with India. A couple of years ago, India withdrew from the negotiations for a regional comprehensive economic partnership in the Indo-Pacific region called RCEP. And everybody thought, well, that's it. The Modi government had talked big on free trade, but after all, that's the old Indian story. The various protectionist producer interests in India are always going to come before the consumer interests, and they're not going to go ahead with trade negotiations. And this brings me back to Australia, because the real turnaround came in April this year, when, I mean, almost incredibly, India signed a trade liberalisation agreement with Australia. So just to tell you, 85% of Indian tariff lines under that agreement will be duty-free for Australia. 69% of all Australian exports to India are now going to go, once this agreement is ratified, are going to go into India duty-free. And there is a 5 to 10 year phasing arrangement for many other tariffs to be eliminated. So there's still quite a lot of protection in areas like dairy, agriculture more broadly on India's part. But this does constitute a very significant change in Indian policy. And the reason I spent a moment telling you that is that it seems to me the UK can press on with a degree of guarded optimism that incrementally it can make a really substantial breakthrough in terms of trade negotiations with India. But of course the UK itself has to be pretty open to free trade, as it was when Liz Truss was the Secretary of State. So now she's the Prime Minister. I expect that none of that will change. The UK has to accept that imports are good for the economy, not bad for the economy, and the cheaper those imports are, the more prosperous your country will be. So it's important to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I'd like to turn to Shevaun to give the business perspective from the Chambers of Commerce.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're well. So, for those of you who don't know the British Chambers of Commerce, we represent the 53 chambers of the UK, covering every region and nation, and 79 British national chambers around the world. So, truly a global network of organisations. Therefore, of course, trade is absolutely at the heart of what we do. And we know that's important for the UK because organisations, businesses that trade are more likely to grow, they're more innovative, they last longer, they pay better. So that is crucial for UK PLC, and of course it also brings money back into the coffers, as we like to say to the Chancellor on a regular basis. About 10% of UK businesses export, about 60% of chamber members export, and that is because chambers are great at helping businesses with trade advice, with the right sort of documentation and customs, and of course with partners into those 79 and counting countries all over the world. Earlier this year, we published our trade manifesto. We want to be a loud, proud voice for trade, which has taken a bit of a battering over the last few years. And that covers not just key asks on how we improve the EU TCA and help that relationship work more smoothly, but more generally on pushing export-led growth. Obviously, we are delighted to hear from this government about growth. That's really important for business, and we think exports should be a really crucial part of that. There are great businesses around the UK who might, for example, export to 2 markets. Why aren't they exporting to 10 markets? They already know how to do it. So let's build together a national trade accelerator to help our businesses around the country do that. So the CPTPP that we're talking about today is yet another a great move towards helping that happen. What we need to do, we need to work with the Department of International Trade, is to help SME exporters understand what that means. So trade agreements are great, but of course it is businesses who trade, and actually helping businesses understand how to do it, where to do it, and hand-holding them through that journey from factory or office gate through to their customer at the other end in those markets is absolutely crucial to driving that export-led growth. So looking forward to discussing that today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shevaun. I'd now like to hand the floor to Aileen of Diageo.
Thanks, Stephen, and delighted to partner with you again in this series of fringes, and lovely to see a standing room only fringe again. We've obviously got a big draw. Thank you. I'm going to talk about three things today. Firstly, about why trade is important to Diageo and why that's important to growth and jobs and investment in the UK and around the world. Also the opportunities that we see in the Indo-Pacific, huge opportunities for growth there. And then, conference has talked a lot, there's been a lot of focus on growth and why international trade is so important to it. So I'll tell you a little bit about Diageo first. We're the UK's biggest food and drink exporter. Many people aren't familiar with the name, but you'll be familiar with our brands. We have Tanqueray, Guinness, Johnnie Walker. And I just want to take you on a little journey back to when John Walker first founded Johnnie Walker, and it kind of gets to the nub of why international trade is so important. So he opened a shop in a small town in Ayrshire called Kilmarnock, and he noticed that the only way that he could do something different was actually to bring herbs and spices from around the world. So to get a competitive advantage, he brought these products from around the world and sold them in this small town in Ayrshire. But he had a bigger plan. He decided to make a blended Scotch whisky that then he would take and sell to the four corners of the world. So he sent people literally with suitcases to the four corners of the world to sell this brand. And that approach and the importance of that global approach is something that we hold dear at Diageo now. So international trade is absolutely important. To give you a sense, 85% of what we make in Scotland is sold around the globe. To put that into figures, and I've been boring you with these already, it's about 2.5 billion of export value. But put that into bottles, it's 14 bottles of Scotch sold every second, of which 7 are Johnnie Walker whisky, so a massive story, and sometimes that I think people don't often really think about when they think about Scotch. Now, why is that important on the domestic agenda? In Scotland, we have our biggest global supply centre for Scotch. We make 50 million cases of Scotch whisky every year, and throughout the whole Scotch industry, we're about 5 million export value, supporting about 50,000 jobs throughout the UK, so hugely important to the UK economy. But it's important that we do that in the right way and that we grow sustainably and responsible. And at Diageo, we've got a big focus on working in the local communities to use energy most efficiently. We've got reduction targets on carbon to be carbon neutral by 2030, but also to make sure that we're using water and resources efficiently as well. But growth in trade is important for the UK economy as well. Scotch is about a quarter of the UK food and drinks exports. And we see huge opportunities to grow that through the free trade agreements that we've talked about, but also through tackling other regulatory barriers. I know, Secretary of State, you talked yesterday about free trade agreements being hugely important, but actually there's other ways to deal with kind of regulatory barriers that we face when we come to sell our products as well. I'll talk about FTAs first because I couldn't sit in this panel and not talk about the India Free Trade Agreement. It's an opportunity for huge change for Scotch and a real catalyst for growth. It could be transformational for our sector. Right now, 1 in every 2 bottles of Scotch whisky sold is actually sold in India, but it only accounts for about 2% of that market. But the thing that's holding Scotch back is one of the highest import tariffs in the world. So there's a 150% import tariff in Scotch whisky. That's the second largest import tariff in the world. And there's a huge opportunity that we see for growth there. So we really want to, for the UK government to prioritise these negotiations and see Scotch prioritised within that, but also to look at the opportunities that they have. We've done some research which shows that, reducing the import tariffs in Scotch will improve exports by about 1 billion for the UK economy every year and about £3.5 billion for India. So a real win-win there. I suppose the other thing it's worth noting, and which is quite newsworthy in the last week, is that India notified rebalancing tariffs just last week to the World Trade Organization, and there's a potential for Scotch to get pulled into that. So about 10 billion of those tariffs will impact on Scotch. Now, we know they've only notified at this point, so we know there's an opportunity for negotiations to continue, and we hope that that will be prioritised in the coming weeks. If you think about the tariff that we face on Scotch, 150%, another 15% on top of that will really be damaging to exports of Scotch. So we're hoping that that will be prioritised in the coming weeks. Just to touch on Indo-Pacific as well, we see huge opportunities in the broader region as well. So India is obviously a massive opportunity for us, but in places like Thailand and Indonesia, I talked touched on, this not just being about free trade agreements. There's already bilateral talks with Thailand and Indonesia where we're really interested in how some of the regulatory barriers we face can be improved. So things like we see advertising restrictions or regulations which favour domestic products over imported products. So really keen to see how we can do that. Secretary of State, you'll be pleased to know that your department is leading the way in talking to the Scottish Whisky Association and others about how we can unlock some of these challenges, and they're doing a great job there. So really compliments to the team on that. But I hope from this session you've certainly got from me international trade is important for growth for our company, important for growth for jobs across the UK and particularly in Scotland, and really looking forward to the discussion and to hear the rest of the panel's comments.
Thank you very much, Aileen. And I think the story about Johnny Walker kind of echoes the point that Alexander made about the importance of imports as well as thinking about exports. So the imports are obviously important inputs to things that can be re-exported. Lord Bilimoria, can I come to you next, please?
Thank you very much. And for me, of course, it's very special being in Birmingham, being Chancellor of the University of Birmingham for the last 8 years, one of our biggest universities in the country, Russell Group University. And I'm just so proud when I was here this summer when we hosted the Commonwealth Games, and the university played a bigger role in the games than any university has played in any games anywhere in the world. We were sponsors. We sponsored the baton relay. We had squash and hockey on our campus. We had 3,000 out of the 4,500 students living on our campus, the athletes. That was the athletes' village. It made me really proud of our university and really proud of this city, Birmingham. I'm the founding chairman of the UK-India Business Council. I was born and brought up in India, a country that when I was there as a child was an inward-looking, insular, protected economy, an economy going nowhere with no growth, no prospects. But I believed that one day India would liberalize. India would one day be a global economic superpower. And my dream came true literally a year after I started Cobra Beer. In 1991, India liberalized. And now, just recently, India has overtaken the United Kingdom and is now the 5th largest economy in the world. But, and here's the but, the per capita income in India is still only $2,000, whereas our per capita income over here is well over $50,000, $60,000. But millions of people are coming out of poverty in India as we speak, and the middle class in India, a country of 1.4 billion people, is now in the hundreds of millions. When we talk about free trade agreements, we've launched the negotiations of the Indian agreement in January this year, and there's an ambition to complete it very soon, possibly by Diwali, hopefully by the end of the year, whatever happens. But before I talk about the Indian deal, I want to pay tribute, Secretary of State. Congratulations on your new role and your appointment. I've had the privilege of working with both your predecessors, Liz Truss and Marie Trevelyan, and I've seen firsthand how we rolled over those 66 plus bilateral agreements with the European Union. That was no mean feat, getting it done before the deadline of the transition period. Many people thought it could never be done. The Canadian Prime Minister challenged us and said, oh, you'll never get it done. You haven't done any trade agreements for years. And we got it done. And the CBI, of which I was proud to be president, we played a major role in helping to get many of them over the line, including the Canadian deal. And then after that, again, I was privileged as president of CBI to play a very close role with the Australian and New Zealand FTAs that were completed. That was a phenomenal experience, and the Australian deal, I would go so far as to say, is the most comprehensive free trade deal in the world. It's got everything in it. It's got goods, it's got services, it's got data, it's got innovation, it's got SMEs, it's got movement of young people, 18 to 35-year-olds, UK and Australians, and now for New Zealand as well, can 3 years in either country, young people being able to work and experience each other's countries. We've just heard from Alexander, Australia has signed a free trade agreement with India, and of course the UAE has also signed a free trade agreement with India. Tariffs are a big issue. We've just heard from Aileen, Scotch whisky 150%, cars 100%, but it's much more than tariffs. It's all the other non-tariff barriers. It's all the other access, the market access that we need. Lawyers, foreign lawyers still can't practice in India, and we have the best lawyers in the world. They're there, but they can't practice. So there's a lot more we can do. We're the second largest services exporter in the world as a country. And yet, investment-wise, we're doing a lot. Grant Thornton do a tracker report of Indian companies investing in the UK, which is very big, and of UK companies investing in India. And the growth rate of these companies in India is an average of 26%. They are doing really well. So this is not just about trade in goods and services. This is also about bilateral investment. Alexander spoke about the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And here, as a trustee of Policy Exchange, I'm sorry, I'm boasting, but we're usually ahead of the game. We brought out that report, and then the government brought out the integrated review in which they then referred to the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. And as an Indian, I'm very proud that the term Asia-Pacific no longer applies, and we're talking about Indo-Pacific. And we have in the audience here, talking about Indo-Pacific, the High Commissioner of Maldives, we have High Commissioner of Bangladesh. It's a phenomenal opportunity for us. The CPTPP, 11 countries. We were assured when we did the Australian deal that that would be fast-tracked, and I'm hopeful that will come through. 110 billion pounds worth of trade. Our trade with China, for example, is almost 100 billion pounds. This is absolutely phenomenal. And before I conclude, I just want to make a point about security. And I think Alexander agrees with me on this, that I think trade should not be on its own. Trade and security go hand in hand. With Australia, we have the Five Eyes Agreement. With Australia, we have AUKUS. We have the Quad in the Indo-Pacific between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. And I have suggested last year, and I think, sorry, I'm not boasting here, the first person suggested we should have Quad Plus, with the UK being a member of Quad as well, and then we encircle the whole world. And finally, when it comes to international students, I'm the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Students. I'm the president of the UK Council of International Student Affairs. We set a target for 600,000 international students in this country. We beat that target in spite of the pandemic. International students bring in £26 billion to our economy, and they enrich the experience of our universities. And the final point I want to make is, when we're talking about these relationships, including with India, it's about research and development and innovation. In India, we've got some of the brightest people in the world, and I chaired an initiative at Cambridge University called Tigris, improving agricultural productivity in India. Cross-faculty, it was a huge success, and that is just one example of what we can do. We have the best universities in the world, 17 out of the top 100, including Birmingham, 4 out of the top 10, 1% of the world's population, 16% of the world's leading research papers. We're an innovation powerhouse. Let's partner with countries like India. This is a watershed moment for our two countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And lastly, I'd like to turn to Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I'm really pleased to be invited to speak to you all this morning. And I recognize quite a few familiar faces in the audience, including several ambassadors. I think I've spotted the ambassador for Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the Maldives, at least, and probably a few more excellencies sitting in the audience. So I think you're all wanting to hear what the government strategy is on trade, which is what I've been asked to speak about, and also to give the context of what my approach as Trade Secretary is going to be around the Indo-Pacific tilt. So I thought I'd start by doing a little bit more context setting myself. What is it that we're trying to do? The world is changing, and we need a trade strategy that continues to evolve with it. And what we have seen is the global economy shifting into a different, seeing the global economy shifting. So in the year 2000, 40% of the global middle class was in the EU. In 2030, it's going to be 14%. When we look at things like 88% of those joining the global middle class will be coming from Asia, it's quite clear, by 2030, it's quite clear that we need to be shifting what we're doing away just from those who are closest to us to what is happening globally. And that is what we mean by the Indo-Pacific tilt. And it isn't just around Asia as well. We're looking at Africa's population set to double to 2.6 billion by 2050. So the majority of economic growth between now and 2050 will come from the Indo-Pacific region, not Europe. And for those of you who remember the arguments, that was one of the reasons why we talked about leaving the European Union and taking advantages which we encapsulated in the phrase global Britain. Something else that's changing with trade is that it's becoming more digital. In fact, a lot of trade is already digital. So between 2005 and 2017, most of the services that we delivered were actually digital, and they accounted for a lot of our increases in services exports. So the digital economy is about 15% of global GDP, and that figure is only going to get larger. So in the sectors that we know about: finance, entertainment, law, fashion, education, education, architecture and design, all of these services, we're very competitive. We are already the second largest services exporter in the world. So if we can keep innovating in these sectors, sustain our advantage in them, we will literally the world will be our oyster in terms of digital trade. And thirdly, of course, you all know we've taken back control of our trade policy from the European Union. But given the shifting center of gravity, we've done so at quite a good time. Building on this digital service trade, building on the shift to the Indo-Pacific, this is really the best time for us to have done that. So you look at things like the Japan deal that we've done. We got that digital data chapter through. The EU didn't secure that with their deal. So Brexit makes sense because trading arrangements which we established in the 1970s simply aren't fit for purpose today. We need trading relationships that are going to be fit for the future, not just the 2020s, but also the 2050s, which brings me on to the free trade agreements which we've been talking about on this panel. People will know that I am working on an India trade deal. I do want to secure a good deal with India, and also I want an accession to the CPTPP. That is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I keep forgetting the acronym. We say CPTPP so much in the department. And both of those deals are going to be very important strategically for our future. And they're two things which the EU has not done. So Aileen has talked about Scotch whisky, for example, as something that we would get from having a great deal with India. But just to pick up on something that Alexander said, trade deals are fantastic, but they are bilateral. The ones that we're doing are bilateral. It won't be exactly the same with every single country. India is not Australia. It's a country of 1.4 billion people with a totally different culture, as Lord Billamoria has just explained. And many of the things which we would do with countries that I would say are equivalent to the UK in terms of the advancement of their economies, the GDP per capita, are not necessarily possible. So you look at something like patent protection, for example. When I'm talking to people from India and they look at the request that we have around patents, which we need to protect UK industry, this is it's one of the great things that we do. We also need to remember that India has different needs from other countries. They have a population of 500 million people. They're trying to bring in basic healthcare. Can they afford $36 per pill, the way that we can do on the NHS or in the US? I don't think that we should be looking at things outside that context. We've got to be realistic about what is right for those countries. So the deals that I'm going to be signing are going to be deals that are right for both countries, that lift both countries up. They're going to be right for the UK, and they're also going to be right for India as well. CPTPP is also strategically important, not just because of our ability to trade, but also making sure that we don't get locked out by countries like China, which can be aggressive and don't necessarily respect the level playing field. So it's not just about us trading more, it's about us putting ourselves in a strategically important position for the future. So that's a little bit about what the government strategy is around trade overall. Talking about my own approach as Trade Secretary, Lord Billamoria has mentioned I've had two great predecessors in Liz Truss and Marie Trevelyan, but also we mustn't forget Liam Fox, who pretty much set up the entire department for international trade from scratch. It didn't exist when we in 2016 when we started. And my view is that we now need to actually shift the Overton window in our trade discussions away from trade deals. Trade deals are fantastic, but for those of you who heard me speak on the main stage, they're just the beginning, not the end of the process. Trade deals are building the motorway, but there's no point in having one if you're not getting people using the motorway, getting the cars going up and down. Somebody added to my metaphor talking about service stations that are helping to smooth the trade going forwards and backwards. So it's a never-ending metaphor that can be extended in so many different ways. But it's important to think beyond trade deals, because even when you have a trade deal, there are other issues that come up. There's new legislation that comes up in countries. We look at the US, for example. They have something called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's named that way, but it's actually more about climate change. But depending on how they issue their guidance, it could actually end up being very bad for the UK, because it restricts who can import certain products, which will help to build electric vehicles and other green tech. that's one of the areas that we're hoping to specialize in. So one of the jobs that I need to do is to make sure, irrespective of the deals that we have, that we are actually facilitating better trade as things evolve. We don't have a trade deal with the US. It's still the biggest investor in the UK, 459 billion a year. That is phenomenal. So there is a lot that we can do outside trade deals. We have a free trade deal with the EU, yet I'm talking about having an investment partnership with Norway, which is an EU country. So trade, there's an ecosystem of trade. It's not just bilateral relationships. And I want us to understand far more about what we can do to grow our economy, because that is what the Prime Minister wants. We have a growth plan, and trade is going to be an integral part of that. And the Indo-Pacific region is important, but we should acknowledge how important Europe still remains for us. And one of the things that has become more difficult, as it's become easier to do things with the rest of the world, trade with the EU has become stickier. And there are many things that we can do to make it easier for all those businesses that we have to export and get their products out there. I'm sure Shevaun will know exactly what I'm talking about. As a constituency MP, I know some of the issues that people do have in terms of barriers that didn't exist before, which now exist in terms of trading with the EU. We're not just going to stop and abandon them. We've got to pick those problems up and deal with them one by one, country by country, region by region, if we need to. And in terms of trade deals, it's important to remember that the foundations of these deals last a long time. So once they're agreed, they constrain what's possible to do after that. So I'm not in a rush to sign trade deals. I want good deals with these countries. I remember when we used to say no deal is better than a bad deal. I don't think that has changed. We need to make sure that every deal is great for the UK. And then just finally, we've talked about, you talked about, Lord Billamoria, security. Trade has been primarily a tool for prosperity, but it is also, in the 2020s, it needs to be a tool for security as well. So I do completely agree with what you said. And we need to think about long-term security. We're seeing right now what's happening with the fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war, what happens when a continent does a deal with the devil to get cheaper energy. And that type of trade might look good for the books in the immediate short term, but it leaves us in a more vulnerable position in the long term. So we have to think about trade not just in terms of what's going to be great news tomorrow in the papers, but what's going to work for our children in 10, 20 years' time. We need food security, we need energy security, we need to look very closely at the ways that we're reliant on China, think very hard about what we're doing around supply chains. We've seen what the pandemic has exposed in terms of some of the vulnerabilities around supply chains. So making sure that we have a stable trade policy that works not just for prosperity in the short term, but security in the long term is critical. And so I'm going to conclude by talking about what Janet Yellen said. You know, she had this concept of not onshoring or offshoring, but friendshoring. So ensuring that Britain and our allies collectively have that supply chain resilience with a set of critical goods, whether it's critical minerals that we're going to need for electric power technology, green technology in the future, but making sure that we are growing as a country, but also becoming more secure and more sustainable for the future. That's what I'm going to be doing as Trade Secretary over the next few years. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much to all our panellists. I'm going to pick up a couple of the themes and put those back to the panel, but in the meantime, please do think of questions and try and catch my eye. I'll come to you very shortly. On this theme of it's not necessarily the trade deals, obviously they're part of the plumbing, but they're not necessarily the
entire ecosystem.
Exactly. I'd like to actually ask Shevaun and perhaps Lord Billamoria, from a business perspective, what is it that you would look to government to help with? Once you have a deal in place, what is it that the government can do to help support businesses export who haven't maybe exported before or into new markets? And I think the other part of that question is how do we make more of Britain global? How do you sort of make sure that more of the UK has producers exporting businesses, and that more of the UK can take advantage of these opportunities that we're talking about?
Thank you. I really like the motorway analogy. I wonder if the chambers are the service stations along the way. So what we need to do is, firstly, we need to take the fantastic trade agreements, the hundreds of pages of dense text, and basically help businesses understand what that means. So the communication of the opportunity that has just been opened for you, the door that just, the motorway that's just been built for you, how do you get on that road? And that's a lot harder than it sounds. So, if you are already exporting to one market over here, is there an opportunity, because there's better conditions over here, to move that volume? Is it new volume? How would you do that? The research that we've done shows that when we ask businesses, what's the number one thing that would make you export into that market? It is a partner or a distributor in that market, because the unknown is really hard. So actually using our chamber and DIT network, they work really close together in market and embassies, of course, to say, where is the opportunity? So often our chamber network come to us and say, there's a huge opportunity. We've got a massive infrastructure build. We're looking for UK businesses in green infrastructure, for example. And then we can use the network to go across the country, because we know there are amazing businesses building green tech in every corner of the nation. Let's go out there and find them, give them the wherewithal to be able to start that export. And look, by the way, we already have a customer for you, an opportunity for you in that market. So I think that's the end-to-end piece that is really, really important.
Add on that?
Yeah, I think with exports, this is where I think what Secretary of State has said, government's biggest job is to be an enabler and a catalyst for business to succeed. And the DIT does a huge job in helping us to export, which everyone just talked about. The reality is less than 10% of our companies in this country export. And when it comes to super exporters who export more than 10 SKUs to more than 10 markets, that's only 14% of our companies who export, whereas in Germany it's 40%. So we've got a big job to do, and we've got great products to sell, goods and services. So, and that's where DIT can help. The network we have, the embassy network, High Commission network we have around the world, is second to none. It's fantastic. But do businesses use them enough? Are they aware of the network? They're there to help. They want to help. They can make introductions. They can do research. They can open doors. And I've used it. It's fabulous. We should do much more there. The next is awareness of business councils. The Swiss ambassador was here earlier. I'm not sure if he's still here. Oh, there you are. We've set up a UK-Switzerland business council that meets once a year with leaders from each sector, and we highlight barriers and opportunities. And the government, the DIT sits on, and the Swiss equivalent sits on that council. And that's a great way. So the more of those bilateral councils that we can set up, and Switzerland is a top 10 trading partner of the UK. A lot of the individual EU countries are top 10 trading partners, Holland, Germany, France. They're big individual trading partners of us. We need to build these bilateral relationships. The final point I want to make is this. The opportunities are huge. Do you know who the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world is? It's not Pfizer. It's not Moderna. It's not GSK. It's the Serum Institute of India that make, to your point, Secretary of State, affordable vaccines. They were the biggest before the pandemic. And they have teamed up with Oxford University and AstraZeneca. They made 2 billion doses of the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine during the pandemic. These are the sort of partners that we can work with, and there's research and development and business and government working together.
Thank you very much. We have around 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to take them in clusters, I think, of 3. There are 2 in the middle section here. Could you just state your name and organisation, please?
Thank you. Giles French from the Association of Foreign Banks. And it was great that you, Secretary of State, gave a shout out to financial services, because I think the UK is very fortunate to have the number of foreign institutions in the city, because they're the people who can provide the trade finance, the hedge risk, and know the markets, as Shevaun was saying. So it can really help bilateral trade. Talking about the Indo-Pacific, though, that's very mixed for services, we know that. And I was just sort of really interested in the sense of what you think the chances are of liberalising on services and cross-border, data flows and people, because I think that's absolutely crucial so we can support the wider economy as well. And as a final shout-out, obviously we're here to help.
Thank you very much for the offer of help. I think that the chances are good. trade in goods and trade in services are so different, because in goods it doesn't really matter outside of perhaps certain standards. It doesn't really matter the sort of level of the economies that are trading, whether one country is poor or rich. With services, it's quite different. Many of the countries that we want to sell services to are actually not necessarily in a position to receive the services at the level which we would be pushing. So I think there's some work there in actually letting people know that these services exist, that this work can be done. A lot of the stuff around digital, there are many countries that don't yet have the capacity to do a lot of the things around the data localization, the legislation that we need for data safety and capture. So much of that we do so well because of a very advanced legal system, rule of law, courts, all those things that come together. So institutions and the strength of institutions are actually a major part of being able to deliver services and receive them equally. And again, we are such a great sort of service exporting nation. Many of the countries, when you speak to them, you'll find that they think, well, okay, you sell this, but what are you getting back? What are we getting back in exchange? So showing that trade actually lifts both sides of the party is going to be absolutely critical in order to do that. But I think it's just something that is evolving as things improve globally in terms of digitization and information exchange. I think it'll be far easier to be able to sell services from the UK across the board.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to get Alexander actually turn to you on some of these points as well. I think on the question of CPTPP, I think you mentioned that obviously they're not going to rewrite the agreement to allow the UK in. But I think to sort of on this question about furthering a UK agenda, obviously our specialisation in services, what prospect do you think that platforms such as that can be used by the UK with like-minded countries, Australia, so on, to further that agenda, which we might have previously done through the EU or other forums?
Well, I think you should remember that for developed countries, the liberalisation of service trade is particularly important. We're not so much focused on manufacturing trade, that's important and it's relatively straightforward. It's the services trade. So that, of course, is a huge scope for everything from financial services to, I mean, Kemi's talked about all of these things through to education and so on. And certainly speaking from Australia's perspective, this is always a critical part of our negotiating strategy. So with India, what do we want from India? We want Indian students to study in Australia rather than here. And you're the Chancellor of Birmingham University, and I work at King's College London, so we should back the British side here. But, legal services have been a big issue also for Australia in negotiations. Now Karen talked about our UK lawyers being excluded. It's been really important for Australia to get our lawyers into other countries. So I have to say, when people think about trade liberalisation, they always think about goods trade. Mm-hmm. But in truth, the really big gains for a country like this, or Australia, or for that matter, Japan, or wherever it may be, that is going to be in services trade. And by the way, we haven't talked much about it, but investment. Encouraging free flows of investment, so allowing British banks to invest in Japan and or wherever it happens to be. I mean, it's pretty much the case now, but that has been a huge agenda item over the years, and it will continue to be so.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take a few more questions. The gentleman here and the gentleman... Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I go ahead. Please name the organisation, please.
Alistair Smout from Reuters. Secretary of State, it's very interesting to hear about all your different considerations and priorities in the role. But it's quite a lot to balance. You're not in a rush to sign trade deals yet. Lord Billamora says you're going to have one with India by the end of the year. And obviously you want it to work for both sides. So if, for instance, India said we want to keep tariffs on our car industry, they're currently 100%, but let's say they offer to reduce them to 30%, but you really want 0% trade tariffs because you're also building a trade deal for the 2050s, as you said. How will you balance those? I know you don't want to go into detail now, but how will you balance those considerations about some of the protectionist interests with the people you're talking about and the need to build a free trade deal also for the future as well?
So I think it's a good question, and obviously I can't go into the details of what we are negotiating, but we can take a step back and look at what is it that we're trying to achieve. We have trade with India already, and we want to reduce barriers to that trade, be it on goods and on services. And there are different things that we will both want in terms of products and market access. But what we shouldn't pretend is that we are doing a full universal liberalization of every single thing that can possibly be done and create a single market and freedom of movement, etc., with India. That's not what we're doing. So we talk about free trade agreements, but they're not universal, unilateral free trade. It's basically freer than what it's free. I think freer trade is probably a more accurate way of describing what it is that we're doing on all of these bilateral deals. And I am optimistic that we will get a good deal. But sometimes there are lots of political things that need to be looked at in the round. So I can have requests from a trade perspective, looking at businesses that are in the room. The DEFRA will have some asks and some things that it doesn't want. The same will be the case for financial services. But the exact same discussions are happening on the India side. They have elections. They need to make sure that they don't look like they're, selling themselves short. So it's a complex process negotiating. Everybody wants a deal that's going to be best for the two countries. And what you're basically asking is that there's a fundamental part of all trade negotiations. It's not easy. And one of my catchphrases is there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. With every single trade deal, there is give and take. So what I think I find quite frustrating when the media talks about trade deals is that if it's not absolutely perfect, then the narrative is, oh, well, you didn't get this, so it's not a good deal. We can't have everything. There is no perfect deal. What we want is something that is better than what we had before and that also respects the two countries' sort of different national, whether politics or culture. We've got to have respect for what other countries want as well and not just force a UK perspective of what a good trade deal looks like and vice versa in terms of what other countries might want for us. It's where the landing zone is, the art of the possible. And that's the sort of the trade approach that I'm going to be taking.
Can I just very quickly, couldn't endorse that more, and what you said earlier on about you'd much rather have a more comprehensive deal than rushing into a deal. And that's the other thing, people get fixated on a deadline that somebody said. It's better to get it done properly. Yeah. And also, I just think to remember, this is all about having a trade deal, as the Secretary said, what are you going to do with it? It's to help increase our bilateral trade and benefit both countries and both our citizens, both our economies. And we do £24 billion worth of trade with India. I mean, that's nothing. We've got a target to double it by 2030 to 50 billion. That's nothing for a country and economy the size of India and where it's going. It's going to be one of the top 3 economies in the world by 2050, if not earlier. Exactly. We need to be much more ambitious, and these trade deals are going to help us achieve that ambition.
Exactly. And so just to follow up on that, it's again why I'm trying to move the conversation beyond trade deals. There's a lot of stuff that we will be doing with India that will sit outside trade deals, and we need to look at everything we're doing with these countries in the round. If we are overly fixated on just trade deals, there's a whole other conversation around foreign direct investment, just around improving sort of existing non-tariff barriers, standards. There's so much that will not necessarily be in a trade deal that we still need to look at, and that goes for every country. So just having a better story about trade, not just trade deals, is something that I'm going to emphasize as much as possible.
And I think the point, sorry. And I think the point that was also made earlier on the panel that trade is also part of a broader relationship which might encompass security, foreign policy, cooperation as well. Right, there are 3 questions on this side of the room, the lady in the front row, gentleman, and the gentleman in the second row. I'm going to take all 3 together because we're a bit pushed for time before we take answers.
Thank you. I'm Farah Faisal. I'm the High Commissioner for the Maldives. And it's wonderful to hear the link between trade and security because Maldives is strategically located in the Indian Ocean and under tremendous pressure from countries that we don't necessarily want to be under pressure from. However, while I appreciate the UK want to look at larger countries for trade agreements, Maldives is the only Commonwealth small state that UK has imposed a 20% tax on our tuna. And we are the only country that fish one by one. And it means a tremendous lot for our fishermen. So I was wondering, while the focus is on larger countries, would the Trade Secretary consider giving special considerations to small and vulnerable economies so that we also benefit from the freer trading with the UK? And right now I'm told that we are 120 plus, so we have to wait for 120 trade deals. And to be honest, I feel that's really unfair on small and vulnerable economies. And let me just add that it's wonderful to see Lord Bilimoria up there, who is the chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Maldives, supporting the security side of things. And I would also like to mention that two of the products we import from the UK, one is Scotch whisky to our tourism market, and which is a very large market in the Maldives, and also the risk of sounding, because I'm also the ambassador to France, I shouldn't really say this here probably, but English wine is one of our Naitimba is one of our #1 imports. So if the Trade Secretary would consider giving special consideration to smaller economies, we would much appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take the other two questions, then we'll come back to the panel, please. Gentleman behind you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for all that you do. This is so important.
Sorry, could you just state your name and organisation?
Oh, sorry, Jeremy Bennett from Oxford University. This is so important. Trade is not just about business and money. It's about people getting on with each other around the world. And so this is, I think, one of the most important things that we're talking about at this conference. So well done for everything you do. I think at the risk of flogging this motorway analogy to complete death, I would really encourage you to look at de minimis exemptions in all that you're talking about, because it's the first time you drive on the motorway that it's the most scary, and it's the ability to get on it. Once you've done a few deals, particularly in services, you imagine regulation and the barriers that you have in services to understand what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in things like legal services, architecture, etc. So de minimis exemptions to get people used to doing what they do, I think gets overlooked with respect to Diageo because we focus on the big stuff. Mm-hmm. So that would just be a point that I would try and encourage you. But thank you for what you do.
Okay, thank you. And the final question over here, please.
Hi, my name is Emilio. I'm a reporter for Politico. A couple of questions. Firstly, Secretary of State, you just agreed with Lord Bilimoria that it shouldn't be about rushing towards arbitrary deadlines, but that is what seems to be going on with the India deal. The Prime Minister has continued this deadline of Diwali, which is basically in a month or less, to secure this deal. And a lot of the services sector is basically really worried that that deal is going to end up being too thin. It's just going to be about goods and Scotch whisky, and they had a lot of hopes for really deep services integration with India, which looks like it's not going to happen because the government is basically trying to rush to announce something essentially. So would you reconsider that date so that you can have a proper look at getting a really good, deep services deal, which is where a lot of the benefits lie with India. And secondly, the previous Secretary of State was criticised for their approach to parliamentary scrutiny. And for example, one of the key things was that there was no Commons debate on the Australia and New Zealand deals, only on the bill which implements very, very specific elements of those deals. So the debate was very restricted. And so would you commit to greater parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals, including full debates on the deals, not just on the specific bits of legislation that implement them?
Okay, then, do you want to take those questions?
Yes. So on the point made by the Maldives ambassador, Your Excellency, you're absolutely right. It is mainly the big countries that get talked about, but we haven't forgotten about smaller countries. I think an example of one of the things we're doing is the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, which has unilaterally reduced lots of barriers. And I think that what you are talking about is the kind of thing that we can look at via an enhanced partnership. It doesn't always have to be a trade deal, and this is why we end up, creating. I'm going to extend this motorway analogy further. A traffic jam, because you can only really do one FTA at a time, but there are loads of other things that can be done in tandem. So I mentioned Norway, which is in the EEA, and which we're talking about investment partnerships with. There are many things that we can do. So I think if we can get my officials talking to yours to see what can be done, then we can actually help the Maldives, even in the short to medium term, in terms of improving the way that we trade. And that will help build a foundation for an FTA in the future. Because even with India, we're doing an FTA now, but we had partnerships and other sorts of agreements previously, which helped to build up to an FTA. On the point about de minimis exemptions, Jeremy, I think it's a really good one. I think that you are right that there is a lack of knowledge, a lack of experience in this area. The only thing that I think makes it slightly harder is making sure that we don't lose any kind of negotiating leverage where we've created exemptions, and then when it's time to actually do a deal or come to an agreement, there's almost a threshold which we've already crossed, which might make some things difficult. But I think it's a very good point that you make, and it's something that we will continue to look at. On parliamentary scrutiny, I think that the relations between the Trade Select Committee and the department have been difficult. That's something that I'm very happy to make sure as I start, we have a positive relationship. I'm not scared of select committees. They do a job, and if you've ever seen me in front of one, you'll know that I give as good as I get. In terms of Parliament debating, the deals, the fact of the matter is, trade deals are done between governments, not between legislatures. And if we are negotiating, it is not up to every individual MP to get involved with the negotiation. The bill is there with the detail, and that is when a debate can happen, when we have something that is agreed. But we cannot have 650 legislators all getting involved in a trade deal. That's just not how it works. And so I don't agree with the premise that legislators should get involved. Most of us, and even I would include myself in here as someone who's only been a trade secretary for less than a month, most of us don't actually know that much about trade. There are trade experts. The department is full of them, people who've been doing this all their lives professionally. The job of legislators is to look at legislation, not to negotiate trade deals. So I will push back very strongly on that. And on the point about the FTA in terms of goods and services, Lord Belmoria has made a really, really good point. We want something comprehensive, but it has to be right for both countries. The Prime Minister has a deadline, which the previous Prime Minister had. That was quite a long deadline. We've come, so it's not arbitrary. It wasn't set last week, do it by October. It was set quite a while ago. But doing a trade deal is not a simple and easy thing. So what we want to do is something that lifts both countries. It may not be everything that the services sector wants. We can't, it was the point I was making to Reuters earlier, we may not get everything. We're not doing a unilateral free-for-all deal, but just because we have a free trade agreement doesn't mean we can't do even more later. So that's the message that I would send to the services sector. There's a lot of good stuff that I think that we can get, but the focus has to be on a deal that is good for the UK and India, not any specific particular sector alone. It's got to be a good deal for the country in the round.
Thank you. And I think, indeed, the Australian deal foresees a sort of second bite at the cherry to some degree. But I just want to give Aileen an opportunity to come in. I think we're a bit pushed for time, so I think sort of any questions you'd like to answer and final remarks, please.
Yeah, I'll be super quick. I just wanted to come back on the representative for the Maldives. I think one of the things that I didn't mention in my opening remarks is that, travel and tourism are so important for trade, and actually coming out of the pandemic, helping economies to recover is really important. So I think that balance of how do we get tourism right? In Scotland, 1 in 5 tourists visit a Scotch whisky distillery, but for equally important is when tourists go to countries like the Maldives, Indonesia, Thailand, they can access the products they want, but we can also help look at, very specifically, the regulations and other things that are getting in the way of trade. I absolutely agree with the Secretary of State. Inevitably, we've spent, a huge amount of time talking about the India Free Trade Agreement, which is incredibly important, but there are so many other mechanisms, and the department has only got, I suppose, so much time. So it's time to look at those, how we prioritise and how we kind of get to the things that are getting in the way of doing business quickly, and that's not always through a free trade agreement. There's other mechanisms, and we fully support that.
Okay, thank you. Lord Billimore, do you have anything to add to those questions?
If are we making any concluding remarks now?
Now's the time, yeah.
I think this is excellent, and thank you, Secretary of State, for the remarks you've just made. And with the Maldives, I mean, this is a one-issue thing. I'm declare my interest as chair of the APPG, but it can be done, as you say, alongside. So you don't have to be 120th in line. So that's really good. Thank you. And what you said about the Indian deal is spot on. That's what it's all about. I just want to make two final points. One is emphasizing United States is our biggest trading partner by far. And we don't have a trade deal with the United States of America. So this is not essential. It's a building block. It's very important if we can do a free trade deal, but it's not the end of the world. The next point I want to make is about defense. I think there is huge opportunity for a country like India for us to partner with defense. And we've got the know-how. India needs to wean itself off Russia. At the moment, 60 to 80% of Indian armed forces equipment, whether it's the Air Force, whether it's the Navy, is dependent on Russia. And that's not a good place to be. And here's a chance as a good partner, a trusted partner, and that's the point I want to make. We've got to have trust between our two countries, trust between yourself and your counterpart, Piyush Goyal, between our prime ministers, building that relationship, and then the potential is endless between our countries. So thank you.
Thank you. Shevaun?
Thank you. Just briefly to, I think, emphasise the point. The trade deals are excellent. We are fully behind supporting those. But let's make sure we agree what the execution of those are going to be and how we are going to get our businesses on that motorway. Thank you.
Alexander, any final remarks?
Look, I just want to say hearing from other countries is perhaps not appealing because you think it's not much to learn from them, but I would say Australia has been negotiating free trade agreements for decades, of course. And our experience, taking up the analogy of the motorway, it's like the M25. If you build the road, rest assured, people will use it. Don't worry about that. You're not going to build a road to nowhere. It is extraordinary the way the private sector will flood. They won't drift, they will flood into a market which has become, if not completely unrestricted, substantially unrestricted. We had a free trade agreement which we concluded with the United States in 2006, I think it was, 5 or 6, and by 2018, our trade with the United States had doubled. And that wasn't the government putting in place all sorts of programs and trade commissioners and things. No, we had some of that. All that stuff is fine, but it's at the margin. The private sector will find its own way if the governments are able to clear away the barriers to them doing so. And believe me, free trade is a huge passport to prosperity for everyone. And I'm not sure whether it guarantees peace, not always. Australia's biggest trading partner is China. We have a free trade agreement with China. 30% of our trade is with China. Peace? I'm not so sure about that. Well, that's impossible to judge.
Okay, well, we've reached the end of our time, unfortunately. I'd like to thank all the panellists for helping us, Diageo for partnering with us. Please, could you thank the panellists in the normal way?